Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Can I just please get a quick indication if whether I'm audible?
Yes, you are audible, Tato.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon once again. I am Tado Mpahlele, an LLD researcher at the South African Research Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability. Welcome to our very first critical conversation of the year. Before I go any further, please join me in welcoming our chairholder, Professor Oliver Fuo, who will tell you all about CLES, what we do and who we are, as well as the critical conversation series. Prof, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tato. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking time off your very tight schedules to join us this afternoon. I'm especially grateful to Professor Van Niekerk and Dr. Fidelis Udo for making time to present in today's critical conversation series, which is the first organized this year. I've known Professor Dewald since I was a student at the Northwest University, Potchefstroom. And I was able to read some of his work when I was still a student. So we are very privileged to have him in our midst. And as it will become apparent after the introduction of the speakers by Ms. Bartlett, you realize that they are established scholars that are recognized even internationally. So thanks very much for accepting our invitation and for deciding to join us for today's discussion. For those of you who don't know, our critical conversation series started in 2018 when this chair was established, and by then it used to be a seminar. It used to be in the format of a seminar. But following the outbreak of COVID, we decided to move it virtually, and it is now a webinar. And we decided to keep it like that because of the obvious advantage that we have of being able to connect and encourage those that are out of Porsche to be able to participate in the event. We are a chair, a research unit that is located in the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University in Potchefstroom. We are based in Potchefstroom. And we were established as part of the NRF such a chair initiative, which mainly seeks to encourage research in niche areas that are identified by researchers and proposed to the NRF, the National Research Foundation, and then which are obviously approved after a very rigorous peer review process. So we are funded by the National Research Foundation together with NetBank, and we've been in existence since 2018. And we mainly conduct research in the intersecting areas of urban law, urban development, urban governance, and sustainable development generally. And our intention is to build a legal capacity in this area of research so that we can be able to address some of the developmental challenges that we face in South Africa and the broader African region. And to this end, we have a number of postgraduate students that are here with us. I think, to the best of my knowledge, we have 6 PhDs at the moment. We have 4 LLMs and 3 postdocs, and we are looking forward to recruiting another postdoc who is going to join us before the end of the year. So the cohort is always increasing. And they are also very diverse, not only from South Africa. Some of them come from Kenya, from Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. So without taking much of your valuable time and without wasting the time of the organizing team, I'll call on Ms. Mpatelde to introduce the speakers, and I hope that you will find the conversation and interactions today very fruitful. And I'm looking forward to the conversations and the debate or even comments that you will have to profile at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. As we already mentioned, the theme for our critical conversation is integrating disaster management into urban planning, addressing vulnerability and risk reduction in cities. This is rather a timely and not at all theoretical theme. This is because today's conversation is particularly important as the urbanization that happens across the globe, and particularly through the global south, where cities are growing faster than their ability to manage the risk, which then result in increased exposure, vulnerability, and sometimes very emergency responses as well. Okay, I've said a lot and I'm not even the speaker, and we have two speakers. So please join me in welcoming and introducing our two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Fidelis Udo, who is currently a guest researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Ethnic and Religious Diversity in Germany. Prior to this role, he served as a postdoctoral research fellow at the same institute and also at Andrew Mellon-funded Special Humanities Project at the College of Humanities in the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He also serves as an external academic at the Management College of Southern Africa, Mamkosa, where he lectures in the Department of Public Administration. His research focuses on climate displacement and the dynamics of peri-urban settlements in Southern Africa, with broader interest in urban climate adaptation, urban diversity, gender, and spatial humanities. He has conducted extensive qualitative field research in urban and peri-urban areas, including informal settlements in Durban and Katlehong in South Africa, as well as settlements in Mozambique and southern Malawi. Our second speaker is Professor Dewald van Niekerk, a name which is synonymous with disaster risk reduction scholarship and practice. He is a professor of geography and the founder and head of the African Center for Disaster Studies, a unit for environmental sciences and management at the Northwest University. He is a South African BRNRF rated researcher. He has authored and co-authored more than 150 publications, which includes peer-reviewed articles, books, chapters in books, and international as well as national research reports. He has been a project leader for local, national, and international disaster risk reduction projects, and has undertaken disaster risk reduction research and consulting in numerous countries worldwide. He is the program leader for the honors in geography and environmental management in the School of Geo and Spatial Sciences, and the PhD in disaster risk sciences in the Unit for Environmental Sciences and Management. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Disaster Risk Studies. He played a significant role in establishing the Southern Africa Society for Disaster Risk Reduction. His research interests include disaster risk governance, resilience building, early warning, complexity and complexity theory, anticipatory governance, building institutional capacities for disaster risk reduction, and transdisciplinary disaster risk reduction. Welcome, and thank you so much, our speakers, for joining us, and we can't wait to hear your invaluable insights as well as expertise. Without taking any further time, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Fidelis Udo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for the great and very inspiring introduction. I hope at some point you will give me permission to share my screen from my site because here I think I don't have the permission at the moment, but I would like you to give me the permission. Yeah, once again, thank you very much for the inspiring introduction. I wouldn't want to take so much of your time. I know if I take too long, Tato will kick me out, so I will try to manage my time very well. because I don't want to be kicked out. I just wanted to add a bit. It is always a privilege to be able to once again reconnect with South Africa. South Africa is for me like a second home, and I'm always grateful to reconnect with institutions in South Africa. As the chair has already introduced, my name is Fidelis. Before moving to Germany in 2023, I had lived in South Africa for about 10 years, and I did all my studies in South Africa. So you can see why it is like my second home, and it's where my spirit and soul is, apart from my first home, which is Nigeria. I did my undergraduate studies in St. Joseph's Theological Institute in philosophy, my second degree in UKZN in international relations, my master's and PhD in UKZN too in political science. So you can see how dynamic my degrees have been. And I usually describe myself as a very interdisciplinary social scientist. I mean, despite doing my master's and PhD in political science, I like describing myself as a social scientist. Yeah, after my PhD in 2021, which was on climate adaptation, I was looking at the experiences of local Black African women in Durban metropolitan area to the impacts of flood. I did a few months of postdoc at UKZN in a project on Andrew Mellon sponsored research on spatial humanities. So in this project, we tried to look at the post-apartheid South African landscape, and we looked at issues of memory, issues of space, and issues of place. And we look at how this has changed in the post-apartheid context of South Africa. What meanings, what memories do people have of space? And how does those change the way people relate to space and the way people convert physical space into place, which is more of social understanding of physical environment, and even issues of social cohesion, issues of sense of belonging and attachment to place. So those are the issues where I looked at for my short postdoc in South Africa. But today I'm going to present, let me share my screen. So today I'm going to present on a project that I've been working on for the past 2 years plus at the Max Planck, and it is on climate, and the topic is what I describe as towards a critical peri-urban turn in climate-related mobility in Southern Africa. I hope everyone can see my screen. If there is any problem, please call my attention. So that is the topic of my presentation today. And before I begin, this is the outline. First, I will do the introduction and key points for my presentation. Then I will situate the context by looking at migration as complex drivers. Then I'll look at critiquing the models of climate migration. I'll look at prevalent climate change impacts and disasters events in Southern Africa, South Africa especially, and I will do the analysis and discussions. Then I will conclude briefly. So first of all, I would begin by calling us to think about how we think about climate change and how this relate to migration. And much of what we think and know about climate change related mobility or migration, I think is still shaped by a very linear imagination, kind of. That is like we think that people move from rural areas to cities, mainly driven by climatic and environmental shocks. However, but what if that is the only a part of the whole story, right? So that is what I'm going to engage with today. So in this presentation, I will argue that climate change is not only producing displacement through visible disasters like floods or droughts. However, it's most subtly and perhaps most significantly is restructuring urbanization, especially in the context of Africa, and this happens through various issues like the rising living costs, shifting livelihoods, prevalent environmental shocks, and this has a lot of implications for how we look at the future of urbanization. Yeah. So my point will be that climate-related mobility is producing a kind of is reconfiguring our urban centers, and is no more a linear imagined kind of movement, but is now a movement that is more dynamic. Now we see people moving from rural areas to urban areas to peri-urban areas, so it's more complex than a linear movement. And most of what I would discuss today is drawn from a research I have done in South Africa, mainly in Gauteng province and KZN, and as well as Mozambique and southern Malawi. This is some research in Mozambique, Maputo, and southern Malawi. So my reflections today will be heavily drawn from those experiences. Firstly, I want to situate the context of what our research or what my discussion will be about. First of all, global migration has been seen as being motivated by complex drivers. So it is not just economic. People do not migrate or move from place to place simply because of looking for sources of livelihood. And it's not just as a result of political issues or conflict, but it's quite complex, comprising political, economic, social, environmental, and demographic factors. So all these factors combine to make global migration more of a complex issue to understand. And one of the issues that really inspired a lot of research on the nexus between climate change and migration, and even the impact that climate change has on movement, migration, displacement, was actually spurred by the famous groundswell reports by the World Bank, which was done in 2018. It was first published in 2018, and there was a revised edition of it that was published, I think, in 2021. So much research was inspired by this, and in that report, it was reported that Climate by 2050, without concrete climate and development action being taken, climate change could cause or could lead to about 260 million people around different regions of the world being on the move. Or in other words, will lead to displacement of about this number of people. And you can see that among the different regions, sub-Saharan Africa seems to be the most vulnerable and the region that will be mostly hit by this impact. So, and that is because of various factors, including our low adaptive capacities, which makes the region more vulnerable, and also various incidences of climate disasters, issues of poverty, issues of underdevelopment, and what have you. So all those issues compound to make sub-Saharan Africa the most affected region by this climate impact. And even the International Organization for Migration, IOM, has also done a lot of work on this to track how people move, what makes them move, and where they move to. And here you can see here again, also saying, looking at the population growth and how cities in the world will be growing as a result of climate impact, not directly causally caused by climate impact, but the idea here is that climate impact, whether directly or indirectly, will play a huge or significant role in how cities will be growing. So that is the point here. And it says by 2050, cities will become more condensed because people will be moving from various rural areas that have been affected by climate change towards cities, most of them moving in search of sources of livelihood. So this map here actually shows, how cities will be growing. And here at my left-hand side here is actually a quote from Stats SA, but I think I will talk about that in details with time. So it says in South Africa between 1996 to 2011, about 77.8% of migration were internal and 83.5% had urban destinations. And what happened is that this significantly influenced population growth, public health, and socio-economic conditions in the cities. But I will touch a bit on that again. And still on this, the African Climate and Mobility Report, which has also done a lot of work on climate migration nexus in Africa, has also issued what I would consider like a warning or calling us to anticipate and plan for mobility, right? So in action 1 in the report, it says anticipate and plan for climate mobility. It says anticipate and plan for climate-forced displacement and migration, including permanent relocation, to foster social cohesion in affected communities, prevent immobility, drive economic growth, sustain peace, and protect people on the move. However, there are a lot of critique of this model, this large-scale quantitative modeling of climate change. And a lot of researchers have critiqued this model as being kind of putting fear on people and also ignoring other factors that that drive people's movement. And one of the critiques here is that it is too simplistic. The second one is that it is deterministic, meaning it relies heavily on numbers and projections, ignoring the human, the social, and the political, and even the lived experience part of mobility, right? So it ignores the complexity and the intersecting social and cultural factors that drive people's movement. And another critique here is that migration is actually shaped by agency. People have choice. People have the will, people have that ability to make their own choice, from rational choice theory, whether to move or not. And I will tell you a bit of stories, of my experiences of field work where people or communities that were actually affected by climate disasters actually decided not to move, and this was as a result of, issues like identity, place attachment. People get used to place, and when that community or place is being affected, they find it difficult to move because they feel like their life will be uprooted. So one of the critiques is that this large-scale quantitative model fails to put those kind of issues into consideration. And also, again, mobility as well as immobility are also important as aspects of migration. People can migrate in order to adapt to climate change. They can also decide to adapt in situ, meaning adapt in place, by finding ways to live within the environment to boost their adaptive capacities. And another one is that it fails to consider the differences or the difficulty in distinguishing between disasters typologies. We have slow onset disaster, issues like flash flood that might cause people to just move suddenly. And we have slow onset disasters like, gradual agricultural decline that gives people time to plan, to adapt. And all those issues are the major critique of this large scale model. And briefly, because the context of my research is Southern Africa, we know that in the past years, there have been a lot of climatic and environmental issues in Southern Africa, talking about the droughts in Cape Town, the floods in KZN and other parts of South Africa, the cyclones, especially the recent cyclone that affected a greater part of Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. And then we talk of even the cyclone in Tonga in 2024, in June 2024, that affected a whole community. So all these are some of the disasters, some of the environmental issues that motivate people to move from one place to another in order to adapt. And this has led to various issues: livelihood and agricultural decline, water scarcity, increased migration flows, among others issues. And this picture here, I took it during one of my field work in Kolosa community in southern Malawi. So this is where Cyclone Freddy and Cyclone Idai was affected. It was a huge, very big community, and it actually affected a lot of communities. So this was one of the communities, and you can see people are now trying to rebuild, the structures that were damaged. Remember that the last cyclone happened in 2023. So people are now trying to rebuild their structures. Some of them had migrated, some of them to other parts of Mozambique. Some of them crossed borders to South Africa. This is also a greater part of the destruction of the cyclone. You can see the big stones that were coming down from the mountains, So all these places used to be full of houses, And if you can imagine, people are still living here now. And when I interviewed some people that live here, they said whenever there is thunderstorm, they live in fear. Even in the middle of the night, when they hear thunderstorm, they will come out because that trauma of Cyclone Freddy, and it is reported that about more than 5,000 people died as a result of that cyclone. So you can imagine the trauma that these communities are still passing through. This one, I took it in, this was the destruction of Tongat, the cyclone that happened in June 2024. It actually destroyed the whole community, and people are now trying to rebuild their structures. This one was taken also in Malawi. So this place used to be a stream of water, and you can see how it has dried up over the years. And there are farms around this stream, and the farms used to be irrigated with water from this stream. So now this stream having dried up, so the farmers here no more has water to irrigate their farms. And that was a huge impact. Here, I took this picture. The women you see, they are trying to fetch water. So this rock here, there are some running water. So you can see how people are trying to fetch water, because in this community, water scarcity is also a big issue, because climate issues have led to drying of this environment. So those are few instances of the pictures. I have a lot of pictures that I took from my field work, just decided to share a few of that. So for my research, I usually employ I'm a qualitative researcher, and I employ ethnographic observations, semi-structured interviews. And for this research, I interviewed residents of the communities that I visited, both internal migrants, external migrants, and community members. And I did research in Katlehong, in Gauteng, in Zanin, in Limpopo, in Umlazi, in KZN, in Blantyre, some communities in Blantyre in southern Malawi, and communities in Maputo, Mozambique. And the aim of these studies was to try and understand how people's future mobility aspirations and trajectories, relate to climate issues, and how mobility in itself might affect how urban peripheries change, And my main context of research was Katlehong. I'm trying to see how is Katlehong likely to change? Because Katlehong is actually very strategically placed in South Africa, in that it allows a lot of cross-border movement for people from Mozambique and other countries, and even people from various provinces in South Africa who move towards Johannesburg and then onward to the urban peripheries. And from my research, these are some of the issues that arose. First of all, I wanted to talk about the migrations pattern in South Africa pre and post apartheid. And I think we are all familiar with the history of migration patterns in South Africa pre-apartheid, especially with Group Areas Act, where people of different various racial groups were assigned different residential areas, and the Black communities or the people of color, which included the Black Africans, the Indians, and the multiracial and biracial groups were actually not allowed in places where the whites were settled, and most city centers were actually exclusively for white people. So post-apartheid, this has changed a lot. So because if you remember the stats essay projection or statistics, it says between 1996 and 2011, there have been a lot of movement from various rural areas towards the city centers, towards Johannesburg, and that was actually driven by post-apartheid policies that actually now allow people of any ethnic group to be able to live anywhere in the country. So this drove a lot of migration from different areas of the country towards the city centers, people searching for jobs in the city center. So there was a change in dynamics of movement, right? However, recently from my research, I would say there has been a shifting spatiality in that during those period, people were mostly moving from rural to urban areas. But now you see the changing dynamics of movement where people are now moving from urban centers because, of course, like cities, when it is overcrowded, you tend to have newer forms of risk, newer forms of vulnerabilities, and all those issues. So with that, and even rising in cost of living, cost of electricity, especially in the context of South Africa's move towards a renewable energy. So that has also impacted, electricity and living cost, water cost in city centers. So people are now beginning to remigrate from city centers towards peri-urban settlements. And these peri-urban settlements are usually located at the peripheries of the city center. So you see this changing dynamics of movement. And again, with post-apartheid development policies in South Africa, where there is good access road, good facilities in some of these urban peripheries. So people are now able to, make their homes in urban peripheries. So even people who are still working in city centers decide to be commuting. They live in the peri-urban area or the township and decide to be commuting. So I observe these changing patterns of movement. And even in terms of temporality, I also got to interview a lot of long-term migrants in these peri-urban settlements, Katlehong specifically, people who were moving for life. Also seasonal migrants, especially people who were migrating seasonally from orange farms, from Limpopo, from the farming areas in Limpopo, and will migrate. They live in this Katlehong in the peri-urban settlement, but during farming seasons, they will now move towards orange farms, Limpopo and other areas, to do this menial job. And after that, they will come back. So, you see a lot of these seasonal migrants, even short-term migrants who were just taking these settlements as a transitory zones. Yeah. So those were a lot of issues that And a lot of things that I observed from this research, I've already talked about how low cost of living and infrastructural pressures at the urban centers, low cost of living in these peri-urban townships, because when you go to townships, you observe that a lot of things have been subsidized. Electricity is subsidized, water is mostly subsidized, so people are now comfortable making their homes there, and then coupled with infrastructural pressures at the city centers. However, the main point I will make, which I will just briefly state, is that these peri-urban settlements are adaptive. They act as adaptive, but they are on even spaces. And there is growing diversities and diversification in these settlements, which is actually one of the points that I intend to drive at in this presentation. And people have done work on peri-urban settlements already. So it's not entirely a new area. A lot of work have been done, and Lauren Landau is a professor at the African Center for Migration and Society. He happened to be my host when I was a visiting researcher at WITS in 2024. Has done a lot of work on urban peripheries in South Africa. And currently, they are working on this thing called Atlas of Uncertainty, which is an exhibition that will be opened on the 18th in a few days' time. So it will be open at Origin Center at WITS University. It's going to be quite an interesting project. And what it does, it shows the uncertainties, the imaginaries of urban peripheries in South Africa, and how we can rethink about peri-urban spaces in South Africa. So it's quite interesting. So it says the Atlas of Uncertainty challenges the common narrative that portrays African migrants as primarily heading to Europe or North America. In reality, the data show that migration occurs within the continent itself. Around 80% of African migrants move to other African cities. Most people relocate within their own countries, but their journeys are rarely linear or final. Cities like Nairobi, Accra, and Johannesburg serve not as endpoints, but as gateways where people arrive, adapt, and actively reshape their spaces. Found that an interesting quote, and they did this work where they track the paths of migration of migrants in Johannesburg. So they interviewed migrants in Johannesburg and tried to know where they are come from. And this parts of migration is one of the charts that was drawn from that project, Lawrence project. So you can see, so here at the center here is Johannesburg, and all these parts show where residents of Johannesburg are coming from. You can see some people come from as far as Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other parts of Africa, and then converge. So you see, so at the end, all these people now coming down to Johannesburg to settle. And the key question is, what happens when Johannesburg becomes congested? And again, this also talks about issues of emerging diversities and demographic forms at the urban peripheries. I got to interview a ward councillor in the Catoros area, and this he told me about how the space how Katlehong has changed over the years, post-apartheid, how new people have come in, people from diverse ethnic and cultural groups, language groups, different gender groups, different legal status, and how this has even changed the dynamics in the area. And this was quite interesting. And again, other scholars, Steven Vetovec is an anthropologist who happened to be my mentor and my supervisor for my postdoc, has done a lot of work on super diversity and diversification also trying to look at how cities in the world are changing, becoming diverse, and how we can reimagine how we look at cities and urban areas. And he said, one of the statements that he makes, he says that contemporary urban life is increasingly shaped by complex, layered forms of migration-related diversifications and existing theories, such as theories of assimilation, theory of group-based models theory, is not able to explain this. It's something that models is not able to explain, and it calls for a rethink on how we look at cities and how cities evolve, So I found this research interesting, and he has done a lot of work in global major cities, starting from London. He has done some work in New York in the US. And he's also, calling on scholars to replicate this kind of work even in smaller cities and see how these span out. And again, what I'm discussing today also relates a bit to the discussion on southern urbanism, which is a topic that has been discussed more very widely by Ananya Roy on how we can decenter global south urban theories and epistemologies. Then he calls for that there are new geographies of migration and new ways of imagining cities. And therefore, I think it is essential to think of this reimagination in the context of impending climatic and environmental disasters. And I'm coming gradually to the end of my presentation. And some of the issues that I think arising at the peri-urban settlements, one is the issues of changing dynamics and categories of differences. Two is housing inequalities, a kind of inequality that tends to replicate the apartheid experience of, spatial inequality, whereby you see a very rich suburb like Santon at one side, and at the other side, you see the shacks, And these kind of settlement patterns are kind of coming out again in these peri-urban settlements, and that is also being driven either directly or indirectly by some of these environmental issues. It leads to issues of diverse migrant populations in these peri-urban settlements, issues of identity, culture, sense of belonging, and place attachment. How people relate to space is highly shaped by how they see the space and how they feel a sense of belonging. I give an instance of a community I visited in Malawi. Despite the entire community being affected by cyclone, some of them actually decided not to relocate from the community. And one of the reasons was that is their ancestral land, and that is where their identity is. So they cannot move away from their ancestral land. And it even got to a point where the local government had to go to court and seek for an eviction order. So it was actually a very serious issue. And then another one is contested social spaces, issues of coexistence. How do people coexist within this dynamics, within this space? You know, it's also quite a big issue to think about. And I just did some kind of, I was having fun with ChatGPT. So I just put some prompt and said, just give me a illustration of the future of peri-urban settlements in Africa in the context of impending climatic disasters. And this came out, you can see the diversity, the diversification, you know, different spatial structures. And I think this also calls us to reimagine how we, you know, look at this, and also reimagine the kind of peri-urban settlement, the kind of urbanization that we are looking at in future in Africa. Right, you can see the coexistence of formal and informal housing, diverse livelihoods, and different forms of people. And in conclusion, I would say urban peripheries are not just passive zones, but they are active, adaptive spaces. And I call these secondary climate margins. And they significantly shape African urban futures. And these peri-urban spaces reveal deep socio-spatial inequalities, contested belonging, and uneven adaptation. And these newer diversities in these settlements actually speaks to the future of social cohesion. How will people live together? How can local government manage subtle or explicit conflict that might arise as a result of this diversification? And finally, I would say climate mobility must be understood as political, uneven, and embedded in history. And this calls us to rethink about urban theory and local government planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Udo. Without going any further and wasting any more time, please join me in welcoming Professor Van Niekerk. Prof, over to you.
Oh, let me just try and get my technology working on this side. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction that you did earlier. Sometimes when you hear these things, you think, who are people talking about? But thank you for that. Let me see if I can get my screen shared on this side. Well, just a second. Let me just quickly switch on my camera at least so that people can see me. I've been having some connectivity issues on campus. I think some of the other people as well with Wi-Fi. So I'm going through my phone, so I'm not going to keep my video on. But this is what I look like. Not a pretty picture, but thank you very much for the invitation. I do appreciate it. And I'm so glad to see that the research chair are really progressing in all the things you guys are doing. It's wonderful to see it. I've seen the chair from its start when it was Professor du Plessis, if I remember correctly, and where you are now. And I must really commend you as a unit of the university. You're doing some really interesting research, and I find it exciting to be a part of that as well. So let me try and do the share of the screen again. And hopefully this works. There we go. I hope everyone can see that. Okay. So my research talk today is going to focus on some work that I've been revisiting actually for the third time since the promulgation of the Disaster Management Act. And that is looking at planning in terms of disaster risk reduction, the presence of it within our municipalities, being all three units or spheres of municipalities, so to speak. And then also we can extrapolate that to our provinces to get a picture. But I've also brought in the focus on climate change governance as well. For many decades, we have now said and emphasized that disaster risk reduction issues and climate change adaptation must be seen as two sides of the same coin. What we gain in the one, we gain in the other, and what we lose in the one, we also lose in the other. And I think Dr. Udo's presentation just clearly highlighted again that we sit with these immense complexities within local government sphere. Sometimes we don't understand them, but we need to get a handle on where we are going with our urban and our peri-urban planning into the future, and how this planning impacts on the disaster risk which we face, how disaster risk can exploit, obviously, these various changes, but then also very important, how do we adapt? For so long, adaptation, and I think even now, is seen as a very abstract term, which it should not be. This is something that I believe local government should get to terms with much more. And that implementation of it must be seen through our development planning. And this is, and as some of the research will show, that is something that is severely lacking at this stage. And it's something I think that should worry us. Because of how our planning in South Africa is structured. So what I'm presenting in terms of the background context, I don't think is specifically new to anyone. We are not starting from scratch in South Africa. We've been having a Disaster Management Act since 2002. I think everyone that lived through COVID and lived through the electricity as a disaster and lived through floods and droughts and all of these national states of disasters that we've declared are well aware of this legal mechanism and how it can be applied and how it can be abused as well. We also have the National Disaster Management Framework, which are less well known, which was published in 2005, which actually gives embodiment to what the Disaster Management Act requires of us. And it's much more specific on what should happen at local government level. Then we know of the different requirements that the Act places on municipalities. It requires the establishment of certain structures, being the Disaster Management Center at all levels of local government now. It also requires the very important coordination between our district and our local municipalities, and then also the integration of our disaster risk reduction planning within our integrated development plans. And that has been locked around for a long time. And that has been the focus of a lot of our studies in the past decades, was to ask this question, to what extent do we find this integration actually happening, and what does it look like? And how does it manifest at local government level at the end of the day? And what are the benefits of it? What can we see change? And these are very difficult questions to ask and answer in the same time. But we also have other mechanisms that we need to be aware of. For instance, PLUMA, the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, which requires risk-informed spatial planning at the municipal level. And then we also have, obviously, the Municipal Systems Act, which gives this duty of creating a safe environment within our local space as well. And now, lo and behold, after so many years, we also have the Climate Change Act, which was enacted, I think it was early this year. I thought it was 2024, but I think it was early in this year that it was enacted, if I remember correctly. And this now places another level of obligation on various organs of states and municipalities to map and to plan for and to assess climate adaptation needs, etc., across the board. But it also acknowledges the fact that it doesn't function in isolation. It also requires very close cooperation with risk-informed development and with disaster risk reduction at the end of the day. And looking at a international perspective which informs this context is obviously our international frameworks, and the one being the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and particularly Target E, which calls for local disaster management plans to be expanded by 2020, and it's already been 5 years now. And we're also doing an interesting project with the African Union Commission, where we, as the African Centre for Disaster Studies, are assessing all of the countries in Africa to determine to what extent do they adhere to the Sendai framework. And we've done this now 4 times. We're in the 4th iteration, every biennial, every 2nd year. So we've been busy with this project for 8 years. And it is worrying to see that on a continent, there's very little movement within local government sphere to ensure that strategies and plans are developed. And there's some obvious reasons that we all know why this is not happening, but it's definitely an area of concern. So the rationale and the motivation of this research, like I've mentioned, was to revisit what we've done in the past, and to see, let's dig a bit more in depth and get to the bottom of the problem. Currently, what I'm presenting is around about 80 municipalities that we've assessed so far. I've tried to keep the completed provinces just for the sake of this presentation, but there's a lot more that we've been doing. And to give us another idea of where we are and where are we going. The core problem obviously looks at the gap between what the law requires and what's actually happening at grassroots level. And we've said it so many times, South Africa has got really good legislation, we've got really good policies in place, but implementation remains our biggest Achilles heel in so many spheres and areas of government. What we also see is that the 3 tiers of government, this intergovernmental system that we've created, also creates certain structural dependencies and structural risks that is not 100% addressed or fully addressed. And when we foresee that we find district municipalities weak or maybe under-resourced, then those local municipalities under that district are also left out in the cold and without a formal coordinating mechanism. But sometimes the opposite is also true. We find some local municipalities that are well-resourced, most of them coming out of the pre-1994 era that is kind of just found this new embodiment within the district sphere. But they are more established and they are more well-resourced, and they've got a kind of a history, and I'll show you some of this as well, of disaster risk being very important to them. And therefore, it's logical to see that you sometimes find a very, very strong local municipality within a district, and there's just, at a district level, there's just not the resources and capacities to assist. And then obviously, the climate DRM integration deficit. And what I mean by that is that there's legal obligation of municipalities where they must align climate issues with disaster risk management plan and disaster risk considerations. Have not yet fully developed standalone or focused climate adaptation instruments, and that is something that hopefully we'll see become more prominent, because the Climate Change Act is still quite new. But that being said, if we are honest and we look at well-performing municipalities, you see that for many years they've already addressed climate change in their planning. So it would be very unfair to just do a blanket kind of, okay, there's nothing out there. There's actually quite a lot. But unfortunately, those provinces don't form 100% part of the assessment that I'm going to show now. So there's, just as a full disclosure, obviously, there's some provinces that, once we put all of this together, would change the figures a bit and make it look better. And obviously, this kind of focus on climate change is much more prevalent within our metropolitan areas than what we see elsewhere. So what this review is basically about now is just to give a structured narrative on the status where we are. We have assessed qualitatively the climate change, IDP, disaster risk management strategies, frameworks that we could get our hand on. And it wasn't assessed around any specific audit or standardized survey that in order to do comparison. A lot of these project or plans are nuanced within municipalities. So you kind of have to read between the lines to also understand what they say. So it's not just a tit-for-tat kind of comparison. I don't think that is ever the idea to do that, because development in municipalities vary significantly from province to province, and then between districts and local municipalities as well. The 4 of the 9 provinces that we looked at, well, like I said, we looked at all of them. We can't still looked at, but the ones that I chose was Gauteng, Eastern Cape, Free State, and then also Limpopo. It gives us kind of a broad perspective of South Africa, and that were those that we initially just found enough information. But we shouldn't try and extrapolate this now to national level. As I said, we must be aware that some of the things are still in the making, and we will have a full review hopefully before the end of the year. So where do we stand? What have we found so far within these 80-odd municipalities? Now, first of all, interesting, 41%, almost 42% of municipalities do have a disaster management plan that is in place. That is clear, it's distinguishable, it's something that we can put on the table and say, well, yes, here's the plan. 7% of that does have its own plan, but it's very much district dependent. This is this dependency that I talked about between our locals and our district municipalities. 15%, which are district dependent, has also got some kind of a shared arrangement. You see standard or memorandums of agreement between municipalities and locals, but also then between municipalities and districts, and sometimes even MOUs between bordering municipalities across provinces. Which I think is wonderful, and it's something that will give us the ability to do as well. 8.3% within draft review or approval stage, and then 4.8% of these municipalities do not have any specific plans or identifiable plans in place. Now, there is definitely a grey zone that matters, and that's like 90% of the cases. We could not confidently classify it at this stage, and that's partly because of data limitations, which we'll still look into. But it also signals that from a substantial share of these municipalities, the planning status is not clearly visible in the available documentation. And that's a quite concern, because I mean these laws are very specific in saying what should be in place. And if we look at what the National Disaster Management Centre has put out there over the past decades, there's enough documentation to allow municipalities to do planning. I don't think there's any reason why they should not be in place. But if you dig deeper, you will find that mostly it is because of this lack of capacities, sometimes disaster management centers being seen as a political ball that they can play with. Political appointments are being made where people are not necessarily capacitated for doing the job, and therefore it is not important. It becomes very important once we have a disaster, but not in the integrated disaster risk reduction fashion that we require. In terms of climate change adaptation planning, the picture looks a bit different, and it was quite stark. Only 17, almost 18% of the municipalities shows that they have integrated anything in terms of climate change or have a own climate change framework. Now compare that to the 42% almost of the disaster management planning. It is obviously lacking behind. There's various reasons for this, but the need, and I want to emphasize it again, for proper planning is the integration of all of these things. I dread that we will, again, for decades on end, go down the route of having all these separate plans for municipalities. The window of opportunity is now to get municipalities to do that integrated planning as part of the integrated development plan. That is, to me, is such a key thing, that we shouldn't be looking at these standalone plans. We shouldn't be assessing them to say, well, do you have a plan? because once again, there's this assumption that it runs on its own, and we can't have climate change adaptation planning and disaster risk management planning as separate things to our development. It doesn't make sense. There's no way that we're going to make any kind of leeway if we keep on doing this. Then just I'm picking up some of the stats here. The 30.1% of the district and provincial climate frameworks that's being used. So there's also this dependency even on a higher level of the spheres of government, where districts are very much dependent, especially the Eastern Cape, on provincial frameworks, and they would cite that as well. And then 42.9% with no clear policy or anything like that in place. And that is obviously area of great concern. Now let's look at some of the comparison between our metro districts. Well, we all know that our metropolitan municipalities have always fared much better than our district municipalities in many cases, and this is certainly what we find as in our assessment as well. So of these municipalities that we've chosen, we've obviously got these 6 big metros, and the progress is weighted much more towards Gauteng, which has got 3 of the metros, and we know that they have been doing fairly well in terms of their planning, not so much in implementation always, but at least they are doing certain things in planning and some interesting work within the green and blue and whatever infrastructure that they put out there. In contrast to our local municipalities, we see that only 36% of local municipalities clearly shows that they have a disaster risk management plan. And looking back at our assessment we did in 2017, it is exactly the same. So the 36 in 2017 related to all of municipalities, because the 36 now only relates to these municipalities within the identified provinces. But as it currently stands, that is also kind of the worrying factor, that why have we not moved in 78 of local municipalities compared to what we've assessed a decade ago? And this surely shouldn't be the case. We should move. And I can promise you, if we really do the fine-grained research and we start comparison up to exactly what's in those plans, you'll probably find that some of those plans are exactly the same plans that were submitted 10 years ago, and this is not on. Then we shouldn't be asking the question why our communities face devastation in the face of our various hazards and disasters that occurs. There should be definitely be more movement. So of these 6 metros, which is around about 7% of the sample, they are very much anchored in verifiable implementation. As we know, the metros are very much better in converting the planning into actual actions, and this is normal for us to see. So unfair to compare the 2 props, say one is doing better than the others, but we must recognize the fact that our local municipalities covers many more area in South Africa than the others. So in terms of provincial comparison, just to take it up a bit, I've already mentioned that the Gauteng province is definitely the strongest in the sample, and obviously it's biased towards those metros that we have, but also some interesting in terms of one of the districts that I'll mention. Some moderate coverage within Limpopo, and if we compare that to what was happening in 2017, Limpopo has really moved a lot. And then the Eastern Cape is much more mixed picture between the districts and the locals and the metro as well. And then in the Free State, we see there's actually a reduction in the amount of planning that we see at district and then at local level as well, which is one of the concerning issues in the provinces as well. Now, to take it just to compare between why is it that we find this kind of conflict between local district municipalities and why locals in some districts fare better than others? As I already mentioned, it was interesting to note that the district municipalities that had a much longer standing history of having disaster management or emergency management centers, having looked at disaster risk as development problems for a very long time, fares much better than the others. And they particularly, I think West Rand, Sedibeng municipality in Gauteng, Sarah in the Eastern Cape, which I think is one of our district municipalities that even had the first disaster management centre in South Africa for a district. I talk under correction, but I think it's been around about 35, 40 years. So it shouldn't be surprising that where we find that they have a long-standing tradition of supporting disaster risk management, that they also fare much better. And then Free State municipalities, as I mentioned, and some of those in the Eastern Cape, shows much more high levels of vulnerability due to this lack of planning that they have. So what can we say for now? Well, obviously the uneven planning or the maturity that I've talked about already. This is strongly shaped by this intergovernmental dependency, as mentioned. But it's not new. I think this is not something that we should. It's something that it surprises us. It's something that echoes out of literature that has long been said within disaster risk governance in South Africa. But it is important to have this empirical evidence now and to anchor it and to take it further and to then do this comparative assessment from previous years and then give us a much more fine-grained understanding. Then, secondly, climate change adaptation planning is lacking behind disaster risk management planning, as we mentioned. And given that climate risk is the primary driver of disaster risk and the frequency of disaster risk and severity within South Africa, it is the structural vulnerability that the sectors needs to address urgently, especially now that we have the Climate Change Act in place. That is a legal mechanism that can be used. Thirdly is our metropolitan areas, that leads, which obviously they can't carry the national narrative yet. They cover quite a lot of people, but they don't cover major areas. And disaster knows no borders. We know this. So the performance of the metros should not be obscured with the reality that almost 80 local municipalities assessed are lagging behind in terms of both policy planning dimensions. And fourthly, the structural dependency that I mentioned needs to be addressed, and that is the appropriate response, I think, probably not to treat this as a failure of the local municipalities, but to rather see how do we invest better in district tier to ensure that there is better coordination with locals and supporting the system, because we've seen that works in other districts, and there's no reason why they should not be working through the district development model, etc., as we're quite aware of. So I think in conclusion, what we should just note, as I mentioned right in the beginning, is just indicative findings at this stage. Hopefully we'll get that report out that gives us the full picture later of the year, but I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. I think that the picture is going to change significantly, which kind of really cuts to my core, because I've been around now for almost 30 years in this domain, and it's very worrying to see that we're making so little progress in terms of an aspect that I think is core to better development. And I mean, the value of this study is that it gives us this structured baseline. It's something that we can reflect on again and to keep people accountable for better planning and to address these very, very important risk-informed development processes that must be in place for us to make any inroads in terms of reducing our disaster and preventing disasters from wiping out development gains that we've gained through very, very difficult processes in South Africa. So that is what I have for you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that. The presentations were interesting and they offered invaluable insights. I think we are reminded that cities are not only just places where we live and work and commute, but just also places where disasters consistently and politely ignore the disciplinary boundaries and issues such as integration and operationalization do also arise. So thank you so very much for that. And I'm sure that the audience would like to further engage with you. And for that, I am opening the floor for the question and answer session, which will be facilitated by Mr. Sandile Mbizeni. So, Mr. Mbizeni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mpeshele, for that. So for the Q&A session, this is how we're going to conduct it. We are going to have a series of sessions in which in session 1, we're only going to take 5 hands. And then from there, if there are any further questions, we're going to have them in session 2. So what's going to happen is in session 1, the 5 hands that we're going to take, please, before you ask your question, indicate to whom your question is directed to, and would please request that you only ask one question so that the presenters can engage thoroughly with your question. And our request is that once the question is asked, we'll revert back to whom it is asked to. So just for the purposes of that, I'm just going to identify the hands that are there in the order in which I identify the hands. It's the order in which the individuals are going to speak. So if there are any questions, I'm going to note them. May you please raise your hand so that I can note you. With the questions in the chat, I see there are questions in the chat. I think it's quite safe to attend to them after dealing with the questions that are on the floor. But if there are no questions in the floor, we'll move to the questions in the chat. I see Prof has a question.
Thanks very much, Sandile. I think that I'm going to take the opportunity to break the ice, and hopefully many more questions will come after that. My questions are directed, 2 of them. I'm going to breach one of the rules that you already laid down by asking 2 questions, 2 questions instead of 1. The first one is that looking at the case studies that Prof Dewald has been able to go through, did he find any instance where the district development model works very well in the area of disaster risk management, in terms of planning, in terms of budgeting, and even in terms of expenditure? And then secondly, why is it that he did not focus on the Northwest province where he's based? Is it because of the low disaster profile of the province, or what other factors may have influenced that?
Thanks, Prof. Should I answer that question now?
I believe you may come in, sir.
Can I go?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Sorry. Let me take the last one first. Why not the Northwest province? No, I did not neglect our province at all. It is just that we just said, okay, let's look at how many provinces have more complete data at this stage, and we chose those 4, which interesting gave us this distribution as well. So no, part of the final assessment is to include the Northwest province. So don't worry, we will not leave our province behind. And in terms of the district development models, it's strange, I try to move away from the Western Cape because, always when we bring in the Western Cape and talking about what is happening there, you get this roll of eyes from the audience. But the fact of the matter is that that model that's a very good example where it's actually working. I'll be honest, we did not use that as a variable to say, let's dig into what are these underlying nuances from the budgeting and planning in terms of the district development model yet. That is to come later on. But what I've seen so far is that model is suitable for disaster risk reduction purposes and for climate change adaptation purposes, and also to this interlinkaging between the district, the local municipalities, and also metro and up to provincial level. It is definitely an environment that makes it possible to do that. And the Western Cape has got quite a few good examples between the district and the locals. The Oeverberg area, for instance, that I think is functioning quite well. That being said, in terms of disaster risk perspective, a lot of the shared risk profile of the municipalities drives this cooperation as well. If you look at the veld fires that we constantly have in the Western Cape, that has been a the spearhead of getting these municipalities to work together as well. And as I already said, we should not lose sight of the fact that there's, in many of these instances, there's been a long cooperation between district and locals to do these type of things. So it shouldn't surprise us that that's actually happening. But I'll be honest, to other provinces that's problematic, like for instance the Free State and the Eastern Cape, in terms of our planning, we see less good examples of this.
Thank you very much, Prof. I see Prof. Oliver is satisfied with the answer. Dr. Wendy, I see you have a question. Over to you. Dr. Wendy, I see you have a question.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the presentations. Sorry, I was trying to get into a more quieter room. I'm just going to be quick with my question. It's mostly directed to the first presenter, but if Prof Dewald wants to answer, that's also fine. I did a presentation on climate-induced migration, and one of the questions that I got during my presentation was that how do you distinguish between who is migrating for climate reasons and who is just migrating? How do you tell that, okay, these are climate migrants and these are just people who are migrating? Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a very interesting question, because that is actually one of the contentions when it comes to climate-induced migration. So that is why, I mean, the key issue here is that it cannot directly be linked. There is no direct causality, between climate change or environmental issues and migration, or let me say most of the times there is no direct causality, and that is one of the contentions that even let's say even when you are in a community and you are interviewing migrants who migrated as a result of maybe their sources of livelihood were affected, their lands were no more fertile, or there was a flood in the community and they had to leave, right? Even when you interview them in their host community, they might not really immediately tell you that they migrated because, their crops were not yielding anymore, or their lands were not fertile, or there was flood, or there was something. The first instinctual answer that you will get will always be, I migrated to make a living, So the economic aspect of migration usually come to the fore. But when you keep probing, you will see that, behind this, there is an intersecting of climatic and, environmental issues. And I will say it is quite difficult to really. And also, let's also look at it in terms of the typologies of disasters. Like we have the slow onset disaster, like gradual agricultural decline, farms losing fertility and things like that, right? And people start to plan, people start to like sources of livelihood is now affected too. So people, it gives people time to plan, right? But even at that, they wouldn't say that they will move away from that community because their farms are no, they will move to another, maybe to the city to look for job. And let's also look at slow onset disasters that may require eventual evacuation of a whole community, right? Issues like flash flood, issues like cyclones, right? I mean, it's quite visible to see that this is directly caused by the climatic impact. But then it can still be quite difficult to, really link. But in one way or the other, there is a linkage between the two, whether direct or indirect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Udo. I see Dr. Wendy is satisfied. Dr. Lawrence, I see you have a hand.
Yes, thank you, Sandile. My question is for Prof Dewald. It's obviously very concerning that there's been such lack of progress by municipalities in becoming disaster ready. So my question is, what can we do to encourage or force municipalities to actually become ready?
Yes, thanks for that question. And you're definitely not the first one to ask this. I think the Disaster Management Act is very specific in the sense that although we require certain structures within municipalities, like your center and appointment of the head of the center, etc., the emphasis actually is on the multidisciplinary nature of disaster risk. And if we don't enforce that as a kind of performance criteria of people's actual work situation, in other words, making the town engineer, making the person responsible for social development or for housing or for infrastructure directly responsible for disaster risk issues, then it won't be done. There's so many case studies where everything is referred to disaster management if something happens. Whether it's a social or infrastructure or housing or whatever issue, everything falls on the table of disaster management, which I think is fairly unfair, especially if your center already is unresourced and placed in the wrong position within the municipality to perform their duties. So this is a shared responsibility, and the only way I think we're going to make progress if everyone realizes that there's something to be done for disaster risk reduction. Doesn't matter who they are and what they do in the municipality. And that's key. Where we see in other countries where it's functioning properly is the fact that sometimes they don't even have this unit that they call a disaster management center. They coordinate disaster risk issues and disasters across different government departments and municipal departments because they understand this is what they have to do. And I always refer people back to the Green Paper and say, look at what we said in the Green Paper in '98. The focus was on creating a body within municipalities that brings together the different departments. There was never any talk of a disaster management center when we started off, but it kind of developed into something on its own, which we now sit with. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but what I am saying is this cross sectoral coordination and making people responsible for a portion of disaster risk within their area of responsibility. I think that's the only way we're going to make progress. We can get consultants in and develop the most beautiful plans out there. Nobody's implementing them if we're not implementing them and doing it through various sectors.
Oh, my mic was muted. Apologies for that. Thank you very much, Prof. I'm noting hands. I see Mem Pashela, your hand was up. I'm gonna note you first and then followed by Mr. Nyabonga. Then I'm gonna end with Prof. Oliver. Over to you, Ma'am Pahlele.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is to Dr. Udo. Since you have mentioned the socio-economic impacts that those communities that you did case studies on face, how do the climate impacts intersect with the socio-economic vulnerabilities and the already existing inequalities in the cities that you mentioned, or you can just say Katlehong, for instance. Thank you.
Okay. If I got your question clear, you're asking how the climatic impacts intersect with socio-economic vulnerability, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I think we can look at it from two perspectives. First, from the source areas, right? So the mere fact that people need to move as a result of maybe their economic or livelihood activities being affected. Maybe their shops were flushed away by flood, their farms are no more working. That is also a serious impact on their social, that already places them on a certain level of vulnerability, right? And again, whether they migrate, move or not, also depends on a lot of factors. Because movement is also costly, right? And even adapting in place is also costly, right? Because people need money to move. People will need to move. They will need transport. They will need to go and rent a place in their destination areas. So it already places them on a huge level of vulnerability. And then two, when they arrive at the destination area, they are also likely to face newer forms of vulnerability. Remember, they are moving from a known place, maybe to an unfamiliar destination. That is a vulnerability in itself, right? So there are a lot of intersecting factors here on how environmental impact affects, yeah. And again, even in the destination area, nobody knows what will happen. What if there is, again, another environmental impacts in the destination area in future? So that also places them in a certain level of uncertainty, So there are a lot of issues at play here.
Thank you, Dr. Udo. Mr. Nyabonga.
I hope I can be heard. My question goes to Prof. Dewald. In your presentation, you highlighted on governing the implementation gap to be an existing planning stroke implementation gap when it comes to the climate change disaster management planning. So I was having a question. How have two issues, which is funding and talent, played a key role in this gap? Or if you did come to interrogate such an aspect in your studies so far?
I mean, you nail it now. That those are the two main things that inhibit proper planning and that drives it, isn't it? If you don't know the talent part of it, you don't budget for it, you don't plan for it. So that's definitely the two main aspects. What with the research I've not done, which we'll probably do next year, is to look at a kind of a mini skills audit between municipalities to see what are the types of qualifications and experience that people sit with that occupy these positions. We did that for the National Disaster Management Center also a number of years ago. And at that stage, it was less than 50% of the people actually had formal qualification disaster risk. Although I think, if I remember correctly, about 56% of people were actually have had experience in emergency management or anything like that. So definitely skills is one of our biggest concerns. If you don't know, you can't. And then linked to that is if you don't budget. That's fact. The other thing which is also true is that there's never been a problem in finding money for disaster reduction. You can go to a lot of our very rural municipalities and you'll find a disaster management center that's been built. So somehow they found the money, but they don't have the people to occupy it or the skills to work it. But there's definitely money for this. So I don't think the fact that they don't have money is not because there isn't any money. It's because it's not applied through the right processes of budgeting. And that, I think, is if we do that assessment again, we're probably going to find the same thing. So, like I said, you nailed it. Those are the two main things that hinders proper planning.
My question is directed to Dr. Udo, and I'm just curious to know if out of your empirical studies, you were able to come across instances where people migrated from urban areas to rural areas as a result of the impacts of climate change. You indicated that migration or the movement of people in the context of the topic is not linear, and that we have people moving from rural to peri-urban areas and from peri-urban areas to urban areas. So what of the reverse?
Yes, it's quite, I think the speciality is, I saw instances of peri-urban to urban, urban to peri-urban, rural to urban. I also saw instances of urban back to farming, back to rural areas. I think rural areas in this context will basically refer to farming communities, right? Yeah, so there were instances of people who were living in the city and at some point they have loss of jobs and they had to move back to farming areas and sort of, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I see that there's another question in the box.
Oh, yes.
Richard?
So let me respond to the first one. Impact of peri-urban migration on land use. Does it lead to changes in land use, particularly from predominantly agricultural uses in peri-urban areas to residential uses? Yeah, I think this is very, very important question. And it's actually one of the focuses when we talk about peri-urban settlements, because I mean peri-urban here I think is defined in various ways. First, in terms of geographically, and also in the context of South Africa, we can say they are usually located at the periphery of urban centers, you know. And again, when you look at the socio-historical context. But again, we can also say peri-urban area is, you know, is caught at the mix of both urban. It has some aspect of urban formality, and then some aspect of, you know, farming area. So you will see mix of these kind of things. And then what happens when, you know, there is increased population? And let me, for instance, in Katlehong, I think one of the issues that Katlehong is facing now is the issue of urban sprawl. You know, it's actually a very big issue now, in that those farming areas, there is now an expansion of informality, right? People are building houses, building shacks at where they are not supposed to, at where, perhaps I would say, is not permitted, because there is no very strict, regulation. So it's actually one of the big issues, in that this sprawling is leading to expansion of informal settlements, people even building houses at where they are not supposed to, converting farm areas into buildings. And this is as a result of, increase in population in these peri-urban areas. And I think it's one of the biggest issues there. Yeah. And then the second question specifically said, you drawn from diverse locations, including Katlehong, Umlazi, Zanin, Blantyre, and Maputo. What common patterns emerged across these locations, and where did you observe significant differences? Yeah. First of all, I will talk about one of the differences I observed, and I will like to compare Tongat and Katlehong. And it is what I described as the invisible difference. So what I mean by invisible difference here, I actually did an extensive work in Katlehong. I mean, my main context was Katlehong. The other areas was just to track, where migrants were, coming from towards Johannesburg city, and then onwards towards Katlehong. So one of the issues I observe in Tongat is in terms of the social cohesion, because Tongat has a big population of Malawians, and then big population of Mozambicans. But the social cohesion, because I interviewed a group of ladies from Mozambique, they speak Songa, and they also speak Zulu very well. And you observe that, there is a stronger social cohesion, because I asked some of the Mozambican ladies, who have lived in the area for a long time, and they will say they don't see the difference between themselves and the locals, being the Zulus now. Same with even the locals, when I interviewed, they will, oh, we know that there are migrants here, but they are part of us, So it has got to that point where it is quite difficult to really spot these differences. What implications that has is, what really need to be interrogated. Whereas in Katlehong, there is a very loose kind of cohesion. You can see the difference clearly, spatially, even among among people, So you see this subtle, that is why I use the term subtle conflict, right? This subtle tension among the various migrant groups, happening in Katlehong, right? So that is one of the differences I observed between these two. And again, another similarity I observed between Katlehong and there is this trans-frontier community in Mozambique that I visited called Rezano Gazia. And I realized that this place shares border with South Africa. Is located along the Limpopo cross border, and even in terms of structures, in terms of the people. So you see family, you see friends living at the other side. Even in terms of structures, housing structures, they were almost, the same. So you see that if people in this community can migrate, just cross border into South Africa, they will still feel that sense of belonging. They will still feel as if they are still living in Mozambique. They won't really see that differences. So yeah, so it has a lot of things to do with where the migration is coming from, the language that the people speak. And I also observe in Katlehong, because there is a good number of Mozambicans who speak Songa group, and they also speak Zulu very, very well. So you could see that the social cohesion among this group was stronger than social cohesion between the Zulus and other groups who didn't share maybe a kind of heritage or ancestry or language and what have you. Yeah. So those were some of the things I observed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Udo, for the answer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the question. I think for the purposes of time and that our meeting is ending in 5 minutes, I think the last question can be directed via email, and Ms. Mphahlele can share the email of Dr. Udo and Prof if needs be. I'm handing over this to Ms. Mphahlele to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ngizeni, and thank you for the interesting and thought-provoking engagement. We are now moving on to the final inputs from our speakers. I would like to hand over to them if you have any final thoughts, any last thoughts, or just any insights that you might have missed. So, over to you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. First of all, I will say thank you to you for the invitation. It was really a privilege to speak to you and to also learn a lot from Prof. I really learned a lot from your presentation, and I mean, even from the questions that everybody asked. I think it was a good opportunity for us to learn from each other. And I would say, yeah, that was really very, very interesting for me. And again, I mean, issues of climate change and peri-urbanization, I think is something we need to keep thinking about. What is the future of urbanization in Africa, and how do we even look at these peri-urban areas? Because I mean, we can be tempted to look at them as being backward, but we don't know that that is the future, So I would say it's something that we always need to keep in mind when we think of the future of urbanization, not only in South Africa, not only in Africa, but in the world, So peri-urbanization and urbanization in Africa will be like a model for what urbanization will look like in other parts of the world. Thank you.
I'd just like to pick up on what Dr. Udo said, and that is that these things should not be seen in isolation. He's been talking about migration in peri-urban areas. All of this, at the end of the day, relates back to disaster risk issues, and it relates back to climate change adaptation. And I think the key here is that we need to seriously come to an understanding of what these complex adaptive systems look like. What are the elements that drives them? What are the kind of triggers that we see within them that causes certain things happening? And very important, what are the feedback loops that gives us information about these, call them systems? And once we understand that, we will be able to really solve complex development problems through risk-informed development. And I believe that is the crux of it. If you look at what I've said and what Dr. Udo has said, this kind of is the golden thread through all of this. Don't see it in isolation. Everything we do relate to something in a way. But we need to find an understanding of how this thing fits together in order to solve the problems that comes along with it.
Thank you once again. I will now hand over to Ms. Fidelis Udo, who will wrap up the session for us. Ms. Udo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mphahlele, and good afternoon, everyone. As we conclude this critical conversation, we are left with a profound appreciation of both the complexity and urgency of advancing disaster risk reduction and also climate responsive planning in Southern African context. Looking at Dr. Udo's presentation, which has not only challenged us to rethink the spatial dimension of vulnerability, but grounded this challenge in rich qualitative insight drawn from ethnographic observations, in-depth engagement, which affected communities across locations such as Katlehong down to Maputo. And Dr. Udo's work reminds us that climate-related displacement is deeply human, dynamic, and often unfolding in peri-urban spaces and remain unrepresented in formal planning systems. And complementing this, Professor van Niekerk contribution on municipal disaster risk management and climate change governance in South Africa, a comprehensive snapshot of planning capacity across 4 provinces, has brought into sharp focus the structural and institutional realities shaping local governance. Prof Niekerk's analysis of planning capacity across municipalities reveals critical governance gaps, particularly the persistent divide between planning and implementation, the challenge of intergovernmental dependency, and also the limited integration of climate change and disaster risk management into planning instruments. Taken together, this contribution underscore a central and a compelling insight that effective risk reduction and resilient building require both context, sensitivity, people-centered understanding of vulnerability, and well-coordinated institutional frameworks capable of implementation. With that being said, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Udo and Professor Niekerk for their insightful and thought-provoking contributions. We rather greatly appreciate you for taking the time to share with us your insightful contribution. Thank you once again. And I would also like to thank the Critical Conversation organizing team led by Ms. Thato Mphahlele for their dedication in organizing this important dialogue. And thank you to Mr. Sandile for facilitating the Q&A session so beautifully. And to our audience, thank you for your engagement and participation. Please stay connected with CLES on all our various social media platforms for more or upcoming CLES events where we will continue to engage critically with issues at the intersection of cities, law, and environmental sustainability. And just to mention that this critical conversation session will be available on our YouTube channel. Please do share it within your network. And with that being said, thank you once again. See you again soon. Bye, everyone.